she formed alliances with the Dutch when they temporarily occupied Angola. She provided sanctuary for escaped enslaved people, integrating them into her army. She married and divorced strategically to build alliances with other kingdoms. She personally led troops into battle well into her 60s. When the Portuguese besieged her capital, she moved her court into the interior and conducted guerrilla warfare from fortified camps. Nzinga never surrendered. She maintained her kingdom's independence until her death in 1663 at age 80. The Portuguese only fully conquered Angola decades after her death. The real explosion of the Atlantic slave trade came with Caribbean sugar. In the 1640s, English colonists in Barbados, having failed to grow tobacco profitably, switched to sugar. They imported the plantation model from Brazil. Sugar production required enormous amounts of labor. The work was brutal, cutting cane in tropical heat, feeding cane into dangerous mills, boiling the juice in scalding vats. Workers died within a few years. The planters' solution was to import more enslaved Africans constantly. Barbados went from having a few thousand enslaved people in 1650 to over 40,000 by 1680. Jamaica followed the same pattern. The death rates on Caribbean plantations were so high that enslaved populations couldn't sustain themselves through natural reproduction. The only way to maintain labor forces was constant importation, which meant constant raids on Africa. By 1700, about 2.5 million Africans had been transported across the Atlantic. The rate was accelerating. The 18th century would be far worse. The 18th century was the Atlantic slave trade's deadliest period. About 6 million Africans were transported between 1700 and 1808, half of the entire trade's total in just over a century. Britain became the dominant slave trading nation. British ships transported over 3 million Africans, more than any other country. The cities of Liverpool, Bristol, and London grew wealthy on the trade. British slave ships became infamous for tight packing, cramming as many people as possible into holds. In one documented case, the ship Brooks was designed to hold 451 people in spaces 6 feet wide, 2.5 feet high, with each person having a space smaller than a coffin. The mortality rate on British ships averaged 15%. But on the most tightly packed ships, it reached 40% or higher. Captains considered this acceptable because even with heavy losses, the trade was enormously profitable. The Middle Passage, the Atlantic crossing, was a nightmare beyond imagination. Let's describe what captured Africans experienced. You've been marched for weeks from your village to the coast, chained at the neck in a line of 50 or 100 people. Many in your group have already died from exhaustion, disease, or despair. At the coast, you're imprisoned in a fort's dungeon, dark stone chambers where hundreds of people are packed together, waiting for a ship. The heat is unbearable. Disease spreads rapidly. You might wait here for months. Finally, European sailors drag you out, inspect you like livestock, and brand you with hot irons. You're loaded onto a ship, chained to a platform in the hold. You have about the space of a coffin. The ship rocks constantly. You're lying in your own waste and the waste of those chained beside you. The smell is so overwhelming that sailors on deck can smell it from hundreds of yards away. You're fed twice daily, beans, rice, or corn, barely enough to survive. Some people go mad. Some refuse to eat and are force-fed through funnel devices. Some die of disease, dysentery, smallpox, typhus. The dead are thrown overboard. Sharks learn to follow slave ships, feeding on the bodies. European sailors called them the business. The crossing takes 6 to 12 weeks depending on weather and route. About 15% die during the voyage. That's nearly 2 million people who never reached the Americas. But even this understates the horror because many survivors arrive so damaged by disease, starvation, and trauma that they die within weeks of landing. Yet enslaved Africans didn't accept their fate passively. Shipboard rebellions were constant and terrifying to European crews. Historians have documented over 500 shipboard rebellions during the Atlantic slave trade. The actual number was probably much higher. Rebellions usually happened when captives were brought on deck for exercise. Forced dancing that ship's captains believed kept them healthier. If guards got careless, captives would attack, trying to seize weapons and take control of the ship. Some rebellions succeeded. The most famous is the 1839 rebellion aboard the Amistad, where captives led by Sengbe Pierre, called Joseph Sinke, killed the captain and ordered the crew to sail back to Africa. The case eventually reached the US Supreme Court and the captives were freed. But for every successful rebellion, dozens failed. Crews were armed and captives were weak from starvation. Failed rebellions ended in massacres. Sometimes half the captives were killed as punishment. By the mid-18th century, the slave trade had fundamentally transformed African societies along the Atlantic coast and deep into the interior. Entire regions became specialized in capturing and selling people. The Bight of Biafra, the Bight of Benin, the Gold Coast, Senegambia, Central Africa, each region developed its own dynamics of the trade. Warfare intensified across West and Central Africa. Kingdoms raided each other for captives. The introduction of European firearms created military imbalances. States that refused to participate in the trade found themselves raided by neighbors who did. Agricultural production declined in affected areas. Why plant crops for next year when raiders might capture you before harvest? Why invest in infrastructure when your entire village might be gone tomorrow? The population growth that had characterized 15th century Africa reversed in many regions. Some areas didn't recover their pre-slave trade population levels until the late 20th century. But by the 1780s, resistance was building in Europe itself. The Quakers, a Christian denomination, began organizing against the slave trade, arguing it was morally wrong. Olaudah Equiano published his slave narrative in 1789. His story put a human face on the trade and became a bestseller in Britain. Activists like Thomas Clarkson gathered evidence of the trade's horrors. William Wilberforce introduced abolition bills in Parliament repeatedly, facing fierce opposition from merchant interests. In the Americas, enslaved people themselves were creating the strongest argument against slavery through constant rebellions. The most successful rebellion occurred in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, France's wealthiest colony. In 1791, enslaved Africans launched a massive uprising led by Toussaint Louverture, a brilliant military strategist. For 13 years, Haitian revolutionaries fought French, British, and Spanish forces. They defeated professional European armies despite being outnumbered and outgunned.
In 1804, Haiti declared independence, the only nation founded by a successful slave revolt. Their victory terrified slaveholders everywhere and inspired abolitionists worldwide. In 1807, Britain passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, banning British participation in the Atlantic slave trade. The law took effect on January 1st, 1808. The United States banned the importation of enslaved people the same year, not from moral conviction, but from political compromise between northern and southern states. It went underground. Spanish and Portuguese ships continued transporting captives to Cuba and Brazil, where slavery remained legal. American ships flew foreign flags and smuggled people into southern ports. Britain established the West Africa Squadron, a naval patrol that intercepted illegal slaver ships off the African coast. Between 1808 and 1860, British ships captured over 1,600 slave ships and freed about 150,000 Africans. But this was a fraction of the continued trade. An estimated 2 million more Africans were transported illegally between 1808 and 1867. African coastal kingdoms that had depended on the slave trade economy faced economic collapse. Some transitioned to what Europeans called legitimate trade, exporting palm oil, timber, ivory, gold, and other products. But the transition was difficult and unequal. European merchants controlled prices and shipping. African producers received a fraction of the profits. The infrastructure built around the slave trade, cost of forts, trading networks, political alliances had distorted African economies in ways that couldn't be quickly undone. The Atlantic slave trade officially ended at different times in different places. Britain banned it in 1807, effective 1808. The United States banned importation in 1808. France banned it in 1815. Spain banned it in 1820, but continued illegally. Brazil banned it in 1850. Cuba, the last major destination, ended the trade in 1867. The last documented transatlantic slave voyage was in 1866. 422 years after the first one. Over those 4 centuries, at least 12.5 million Africans were forced onto ships. About 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage. Perhaps 2 million more died during capture and imprisonment before ever reaching ships. The demographic impact was catastrophic. The human cost, incalculable. History books often describe enslaved Africans as unskilled laborers. This is completely false. Enslaved Africans brought sophisticated knowledge that built American economies. Rice cultivation enslaved people from rice-growing regions of West Africa taught Americans how to cultivate rice in Carolina's coastal swamps. They designed the irrigation systems, built the canals, and developed the agricultural techniques. By the 1770s, Carolina rice made British merchants wealthy, all based on African knowledge. Metallurgy. West African iron working traditions were often more advanced than European techniques. Enslaved blacksmiths were highly valued and often gained relative privileges. Architecture. Building techniques from Africa influenced American architecture, particularly in the South.